Our scripture text this morning is from Matthew's Gospel, from a section known as the Sermon on the Mount, Matthew 5, 6, and 7. Now, I often say that what we find in the Sermon on the Mount is the quintessential Jesus. That if all you knew about Jesus was what we read in the Sermon on the Mount, that would be enough. It starts with the Beatitudes, a series of blessings, and then it moves on to the Lord's Prayer that we just recited together. It covers a range of teachings on a whole host of things that many consider to be the central tenets of Christian discipleship. In other words, if all you knew about Jesus was what you find there in the Sermon on the Mount, it would be enough. And then he gets to the end. To wrap up the whole sermon, to put a nice little bow on it, he concludes it by saying this, telling this little parable that is found in Matthew chapter 7.
The scripture reading today is from Matthew 7, 24 through 27. Here begins the reading. Everyone then who hears these words of mine and acts on them will be like a wise man who built his house on the rock. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat on the house. But it did not fall because it had been founded on a rock. And everyone who hears these words of mine and does not act on them will be like a foolish man who builds his house on sand. The rain fell, the floods came, and the winds blew and beat against that house, and it fell, and great was its fall. The word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Okay, church, so how many of you ran the Cowtown Marathon this morning? Anybody? Half marathon by any chance? Any half marathon folks? 5K yesterday by any chance? How many of you walked safely from the car to the sanctuary? Congratulations, well done. Well done. And a special welcome to those that are joining us online this morning or through the radio at KTCU. We're glad that you are here with us as well and hope that you feel the sense of being a part of the worshiping community here at University Christian Church. So Isaac Watts was an English minister, a theologian back in the 18th century, and he was a prolific hymn writer. He was credited with some 750 hymns. Some of your perhaps favorite things like When I Survey the Wondrous Cross, Joy to the World. Perhaps most well known, one that we will sing a little later in the service, O God, our help in ages past. One of my favorite hymns. That hymn is a paraphrase of the 90th Psalm that goes like this: Lord, you have been our dwelling place in all generations. Before the mountains were brought forth, or you ever had formed the earth and the world from everlasting to everlasting, you are God. That hymn, that psalm is a reminder to us that we never know what any day is going to hold, what each day will bring. But the promise of God is that no matter what happens, whether it be good or bad, happy or sad, no matter what happens, in every day, you never face it alone. That God is with us in all of us. That God is our help in ages past and our hope for years to come. Through storms and streams, that God is there no matter what each day brings, that God is with us. Now, some might say that is the very definition of good news. Because I don't know about you, but there are moments, there are times, there are seasons when the world feels pretty overwhelming. Do you ever feel that way, that the world seems heavy? That life feels overwhelming. When the rains fall, when the floods come, when the winds blow. When it feels like the whole world is crashing down around us. This last week, we hosted an event here at the church, a conference with senior ministers from the 100 largest disciples congregations from across the country. There were pastors, friends, colleagues of mine from Florida to Oregon to Ohio to Oklahoma, of course here in Texas. And they gathered here because, in part because the theme was creating a culture of generosity in a large congregation. And knowing that we recently successfully completed a capital campaign, that we helped fund a major renovation, that we put a fresh face on our historical building, and that we're now in the midst of a second successful campaign to eliminate and to avoid any debt, that they wanted to come and to see and to hear how we did it and to see how the renovation turned out. Now, I need to pause here and just acknowledge that I know that I'm well aware that pride is one of the 7 deadly sins. I know that. But I want you to know that I was so proud to be able to show off, to be able to welcome my friends and colleagues, to show them what we have done together here at University Christian Church. And they were so impressed. And they were really envious too, which is also one of the 7 deadly sins. So there was a lot of sinning going on amongst this senior ministers conference. But I relished it all and was so proud to be able to show what we have done. Now, I got to tell you that it feels really good just to get that off my chest. I hope that I'm absolved from my sin of pride this last week. But while the topic was on creating a culture of generosity, I couldn't help but notice how often those side conversations, they turned in a different direction. And what kept coming up over and over with just about all of us were discussions about how it's just really hard to do church right now. That given the political climate, the polarization that we see with the actions of the new administration and the impact it's having on our nation, that it's just a hard time to be church. It's a hard time to lead a congregation. For instance, one of my friends confided in me that just this week, before he flew here, he had one of his more progressive members of his congregation call him with anger in his voice to tell him that he had not confronted President Trump enough in his sermons. That he needed to be more outspoken. He needed to be more vocal about the abuse of power that he saw taking place around us. Which is interesting, he said, because earlier this week, he also had another church member, a longtime member, one of his largest donors, call him and tell him that he was leaving the church because he had been too progressive in his sermons. That because of an interview he'd done with a local NPR station in which he had said that ICE, the Immigration and Customs Enforcement, that if they were to show up at his congregation without a warrant, they would not be allowed in. You see, he believes, as I do, that the role of the church has always been to protect the most vulnerable people, those on the margins of society. And that we call this space a sanctuary for a reason. That it's a space where folks can come, everybody can come to feel rooted, to feel grounded, to feel safe. And this church member was leaving because he said that to do so was to subvert the U.S. government. He was receiving pressure, pushback from both sides, one claiming he's not being prophetic enough, the other saying he's being too political. And I got to tell you, that was not the only conversation like that I had this week. It was repeated over and over again. Like I said, this is a hard time to be church. It's a hard time for us to do church together. And to be honest, I feel that pressure myself. I feel that pressure myself from church members, from members of my own staff, asking me, what are we going to do to respond to what we see going on around us? How are we going to react to this? And I admit that there have been several nights over the last several weeks that I have tossed and turned, not been able to sleep. Because of, as I've said, we have people in our congregation, excuse me, that we have, thank you, that we have people on our congregation that sit on all different sides of each argument, of each debate, that we have people that agree on some things and disagree vehemently on others, and I feel it from both sides. Some wishing that I'd say more, some wishing that I'd say nothing at all. But let me say this, that I've been here now as your pastor for about 7 years. And if you figure it out, about 50 Sundays a year, that I've preached somewhere close to 350 sermons. So hopefully you have figured out by now that I try not to react to the words and the actions of the president, whoever it might be at the time. As my friend said to me this last week, a rash of hot takes is not prophecy. You see, I try not to react to the words and the actions of who's in the White House. Because my job, my call as a pastor, as a preacher, is to pay attention to point to proclaim the words not of the president, but of Jesus Christ. Because I believe that if we build our house upon the rock that is the words and actions of Jesus, that when the rains fall and the floods come, the winds beat down around us, that we will be okay because our foundation is built upon solid ground. That Jesus is our help in ages past, our hope for years to come. I also believe that in the long run, that our actions will speak far louder than our words. Now, I have to admit that that's hard for me as a preacher to say. I make my living on having the right words to say. And so for me to say that our actions speak louder than our words, that's hard for me, but it's true. So when people come to me and say, what are we going to say? How are we going to react? What are we going to do in response? My response to them has been, we're going to continue to be the church that we've always been. We're going to keep doing the things that Jesus calls us to do. Now, you may remember that later in Matthew's gospel, after the story that we heard just now, that Jesus tells his followers, he tells us, that in the end, that we will be judged not by what we believe, not by what we say, but how we care for one another. That in the end, that God will gather all the nations together, he says, and separate the good from the bad, the sheep from the goats. The goats I'm going to send away, he says. The sheep I will welcome into their eternal home. And here is the criteria, Jesus says, that I'm going to use. That when people are hungry, when people are thirsty, when people are naked or sick or in prison, when they're immigrants, when they're strangers from another land, what did you do towards them? How did you treat them? I'm going to look and see, Jesus says. Did they provide food and clothing and shelter? Did they welcome the stranger? Did they care for the sick? Because inasmuch as you do that for them, you do that for me. We will be judged, Jesus says. Not by what we believe, not by what we think, not by what we say, but by how we care for the most vulnerable. In other words, did we show compassion to our neighbors? Did we care for the little and the lost and the least? This is how we will be judged. So what are we going to do? How are we going to respond? We're going to keep being the church that we've always been. We're going to keep doing the things that we've always done. We're going to continue to provide clothing and school uniforms for the students of Fort Worth ISD who struggle to afford their own through the work of our children's closet. We're going to continue to mentor fourth graders at Alice Contreras Elementary School. We're going to love them. We're going to care for them. We're going to teach them, knowing that many of them are probably worried about their own immigration status. We're going to continue to welcome and to provide a hot meal and a warm place for unhoused men every Wednesday night right here in a building through our Room in the End ministry. We're going to send resources and volunteers each month to the Como Food Pantry to help organize and to hand out food to those that are hungry here in the city of Fort Worth. We're going to continue to open our doors as wide as God's heart and proclaim with heart and soul, with body and mind, boldly and proudly, that those who are LGBTQ are children of God and deeply loved. And that we love you. And that this will always be a safe place for you to be who God created you to be. We're going to continue to practice theological humility. Not claim that we have all the answers, or that we have a corner on the truth, but that together we will bring our questions and our doubts, our worries and our struggles, and together we will journey together towards the wholeness that God intends for our lives. In other words, we are going to continue to be the church that we have been for 150 years. Not going to worry much about speaking out against those who disagree with us or who see the world differently, but rather we're going to focus on standing up for the most vulnerable. We're going to love our neighbors. We're going to pray for our enemies. We're going to let our actions speak louder than our words. A few weeks ago, I was reading stories about the horrific fires that decimated Southern California. And as a person who was born and raised in California, it was hard for me to see the devastation that took place, the 12,000 homes that were destroyed. It was so heartbreaking for me. But I came across a story about a home that was spared. It was left standing when hundreds of other houses around it, the entire neighborhood, it looked like for miles and miles, this was the only house that remained. It turns out that this house and several others just like it that also survived, they were recently built using design features with the latest fire-resistant technologies. Some architectural building techniques like a metal roof in a cement construction. There was not a lot of vegetation around it. It was designed to do exactly what it did, and that is to survive a firestorm. That there were architects, there were people who looked and said, with the winds, with everything that's happening, that this sort of thing might happen. So we need to build houses that can sustain and survive in something like this. And in that story, they quoted a federal firefighter, a U.S. Forest Service, who had been deployed for the Palisades fire, who said this. He says, that house was perfect. It was built for this, he says. Not all homes are built like that. Maybe you're sitting here this morning and it feels like the world is on fire. And maybe it's what you see in the news, and maybe it's what's going on in your own life. And maybe it feels like the rains are falling and the floodwaters are rising. Maybe it feels like everything is crumbling down around you. But University Christian Church, hear me when I say this. We were built for moments like this. We were built for moments like this. We were created, we were called to transform the world by living out Christ's courageous love. And so what are we going to do? How are we going to respond? We're going to seek the sacred. We're going to commit to love. We're going to empower one another to serve. Look, just like you, I long for our nation to live up to its highest ideals, to be great in every sense, but most especially in the very definition of what Jesus says is the greatest, and that is to love and to serve the most vulnerable. The least of these, Jesus says, that's what it means to be great. That's what greatness looks like. And that is the definition by which we will be judged. And look, I don't know what tomorrow will bring. But I do know that we are not in this alone. And that we have built our house upon the solid ground of Jesus Christ, that he has been our help in ages past. He will be our hope for years to come. So like I said, this is a hard time to be church, to do church together. But we, University Christian Church, we were built for this.